Alright, this is Biggie on 6/25/2024. I just wanted to make a quick confirmation update to clarify a few things that I put in the last video and post. I don't want to make another post after this, but I just want to make sure people fully understand what's going on. I've seen a few things that I don't know if they fully are following kind of the pattern here, or what my expectations were maybe along the price impact to what occurs along these cycles, and most importantly, kind of what I'm looking for in the option chain, um, and if I've seen anything kind of interesting today. So just hopping into it here. Um, Again, this cycle starts out with a share purchase. And then on this 13-day item right here, this actually oscillates in terms of what happens on with share buying, or sorry, call buying activity. So let's just assume from a baseline here, he purchases shares, they get internalized. On this first cycle here, he is buying at the money calls and out of the money calls only. And I think that's important to kind of highlight what he's doing. And he's doing this over a 3-day period of time. And I also want to clarify that these are fairly hypothetical. I didn't run through and show the exact amount, but this is roughly the total of the amount of shares equivalent that were purchased via calls. Um, so when he buys these calls, what happens is on this 22nd day, we start to see this gamma ramp kind of kick in, and the share price starts to increase and hits his gamma ramp that he's created back here, causing the price to go much higher than just releasing a few 100,000 shares on a low liquidity stock, into these later parts of the 35-day cycle that he started off with here. So what happens, right? This gamma ramp hits. He sells some calls on this upswing right here, and buy shares, right? And this is important to see, this next 13-day cycle that is now kicked off from his share purchase. He's not buying calls here. He is selling calls. And I think that's important to outline because since this new cycle has started here, assuming, on this 22nd day is where he's targeting for his share purchases, he's going into this next 35-day cycle here now with a lot of cash and the ability to buy calls along the way. So what does he do when he starts buying calls through this cycle right here? He's buying in the money calls, deep in the money calls. And his calls seem to be supportive of the ATM that is going on, where he is purchasing calls at the strike, near the strike that GameStop is saying that they think where their ATM is going to fill on average, on estimate over the life of the ATM. So what's this saying as like a normal investor? This is literally just saying, I agree with what you're doing. I am completely supportive of what you're doing, and I think it is very justified of the price that you think you're selling your calls at. But I want to point something out in particular here that's really important. As you can see, he buys calls here, he sells calls here, at this 13-day mark, but he doesn't do anything right here on this next cycle that he's created. He just simply holds his calls. And I want to point this out because I think this impacts this next 35-day cycle that some people might be misconstruing as a potential run. And I kind of talked on this on the PP show, but I actually had mentioned back here that I thought these few days here would be a downward move in the price to a flat trading, but if anything, it should be an IV crush. Because when he purchased his calls up here, IV was so low. Because he purchased his stock and the stock started to actually go down these next few days on very, very low volume, which is a perfect setup for purchasing calls cheap when IV is so, so low in this cycle. So if we kind of pull this together here, this date right here, I would say this cycle potentially here, this 35-day cycle, is agnostic of these past few cycles that we've seen, and it's almost more or less a reset. His 613 purchase is a reset, and we're starting at this point right here. So what would we expect up to this 13 days? You'd see price go down and volume fall off a cliff, which is exactly what we saw, and I'll kind of show what that looks like on the graph here in a second. Do a quick change. So what do we see? when he purchases those shares back here on, and again, this is hypothetical that he purchased the shares around this time. This just happens to line up with the cycle. Um, Working backwards here. This is all hypothetical in the amount of shares that he's purchasing along the way. I could be totally wrong. That data is not as easy to see as it is with his very obvious call purchases and sales. So, assuming he buys here, you see the stock go down the next few days, and then all the way into this 13-day mark that I kind of had highlighted when he starts buying calls here on 624. You see a slight increase in price. I mean, this is a ton of calls purchased in this window here, and it moves the price from $10 up to $12. Like, this is a very small move here, only about 20% move. And then you see it fall back down, and then you see it actually start to pick up here, moving into 5.3. And this is actually where he ends up selling some of his calls and purchasing farther out of the money calls, plus potentially buying shares. Again, hypothetical that he's buying shares here. It just happens to align, if you reverse engineer this, of what's the current pattern we know of his post of when he has actually purchased shares. So again, hypothetically here, he's now purchased more farther out of the money calls. We're running into a 35-day cycle, and now the ramp is built even more. And this is why you kind of see this like flatlining. And I'll change the candles here to just show you what I'm seeing here. You see this like flat line of price action moving in after he has sold and repurchased far out of the money calls, um, and potentially bought shares on this 22-day item. And then we run into that 35 days and he sells all of his calls in this window here of 515 and 514, 515, 516. All of the calls that were purchased are sold. It's just why you see a release of that gamma ramp in a huge descend of price. And then, as you know, the rest is history here on 517 when Cohen announces an ATM after the sell-off has already occurred. But huge volume has hit in these last few days here, which makes Cohen look very smart and judicious with his ability to time ATMs here. He's confirming that there's volume in the market and an interest and ability to sell shares without tanking his price of the stock. And as you can see, you happen to have a buyer come in who buys a bunch of calls, which is DFE, at the strike of the price they think they're going to do the ATM successfully at, which is a great story here. But um, as you can see, this next run, he doesn't buy out of the money calls. He's not building a ramp. That's why this, in my opinion, this run was smaller than this one. There was a ramp in place, but it was not as much stacked, or it was not as stacked as this one back here, where in my opinion you see a mini gamma squeeze. And it plays out perfectly when calls were purchased and when they were sold, and the price is reflective of that ramp, and when the ramp gets sold off of what happens to price along the way here. So he doesn't purchase out of the money calls here. He just holds his calls all the way through, which is why I think when he purchased shares back in here, we get the first yellow post. Again, hypothetical that he purchased the shares there. I would say it's pretty apparent that he had purchased shares somewhere in here because he's accumulated $100+ million worth of capital to be able to even purchase the amount of shares that he had um, at this time. And so what do you see? You see that run up, and then Cohen is just trading off of volume here. You have 5 days of heavy volume. He does the ATM, and DFE does basically just holds his calls and waits till the ATM is done. He sells, and then we know he purchases shares. And so, in my opinion, what would we expect to see here on, assuming a new cycle has started here, and this other one might not have as much impact on an overlap going into this Thursday, is sorry, one second here. Basically, what you see here is, my guess is pretty much nothing. You're going to see the repeat of what you saw back here on 412 when I think he purchased shares into when he purchases calls, which again, my numbers could be off by a day. As you can see, there's that like one gap of in between the orange and the yellow in the later parts of the cycle that are more hypothetical of what could happen, purely because of the fact that there's a few holidays in there, and I just might be off on a day. I'm not perfect at this, but what I think you see is basically he buys shares. This is the equivalent of 613. You see price go down, and then you see on this 13-day ish around that range, you see purchasing of calls in very obvious blocks at the end of the day. That is when he was purchasing his calls time wise in the money over in here, and then also at the money and out of the money back here. He's purchasing in the last few hours. And he's purchasing in very obvious blocks. Okay, I just want to point that out. That was his buying pattern and also his selling pattern. It's very easy to see, and I think that again is it might be just indicative of him buying calls that the market maker is willing to open a new OI for and is willing to sell in blocks to expand the OI on that part of the chain. I'm not sure as to why it was so obvious, if it was intentional or not, but this is just what I saw. So I think 613 is the equivalent to what we saw back on 412. You see price goes down, trades flat, volume just completely falls off the edge of the cliff here, and IV gets crushed, which is exactly what we have seen. 612, what do you see? Stock trades flat, goes down, and you see it kind of keep going down, and volume goes absolutely off the cliff here. So then what would I have been expecting to see on this 525, 526, and then potentially 527? I know I only had 2 days marked as him potentially buying calls this week, but if you look at in the past on 424 through 426, he's purchasing a ton of calls. It's actually a 3-day window. I'm just painting hypothetical kind of bands of what I think where action might occur. Is I would expect to see the exact same thing we saw back here. Very low volume increase, a slight volume increase, and a lot of calls being purchased at the money and out of the money only. And he was, I don't know if I said this, but he was purchasing 3 to 4 weeks out with these calls, his expiration, timing it pretty much perfectly with around this range over here for expiration. So I just wanted to kind of confirm that like this is what I was expecting, 612 through here, and I think I said this on the PV show is like I expect volume to drop off, IV get crushed if I'm directionally correct here, and I expect to see around this date 525, which was today, and then the next day. A massive amount of calls being purchased in obvious blocks at the end of the trading day for these few trading days here. And I would expect those, if he's timing expiration the same way, to be at least 2 to 4 weeks out in the option chain. And again, all at and out of the money with obvious block purchases. Okay, so then what does that kind of lead into? It kind of leads into the exact same repeat of this with on the 35th day that I had marked there. Assuming that there is no run on this 35 day because he didn't purchase calls after this ATM cycle here. All he did was he held his calls through the cycle, sold, and then purchased shares here on 612. I think there might be a little bit of a bump, but if anything, it'd be options induced, similar to what we saw back on these 3 days right here. And then what do you see? You basically see a repeat of this cycle, going into the 35th day of this new cycle that he's created since 613. What do you see? You basically see a run up all the way up until 717. You might see a little bit of a run up here when he purchases calls, slight sell off when he stops buying those calls, and then as you see, they start to release the internalization, and that's where it hits into his ramp and creates a much more volatile market scenario than if he were to have not had any calls, or there would be no stack in the option chain at this time. And then who knows how much internalization was here. It's basically running into his ramp at this point towards the expiration of those options. I don't know how much the FTDs actually have an impact here. He's basically caught them in a trap at this point and owns the whole option chain and gets to dictate kind of what happens with price at this point. So I think we see this big run up into 719 basically towards the end here. That's where you see the kind of the high point. Volume's going to be very dependent on if an ATM occurs again. If we don't see crazy volume, we just see 1 or 2 days of high volume, expect him to probably release those calls, cash in on the cash, and expect another ATM here past the 717 mark here. Another ATM, and then he takes that cash and then just basically puts it back into at the money calls of wherever the new floor is or wherever GameStop feels it's appropriate, or where they think the ATM is actually going to get priced at and how much funds they're going to um, received from the proceeds of that ATM. And then expect that next run that he kind of creates along the way. Again, he's probably going to sell a little bit of calls over here and buy shares again to create another cycle on this next run. Who's going to capitalize the most? More than likely would be not him because he's bought in the money calls on that next cycle, but GameStop. And again, they're not, I don't think GameStop is really playing off of what Roaring Kitty does. If anything, Roaring Kitty's being a prudent investor and kind of expecting what GameStop might be doing given their situation. You know, more funds that they have, the better with where the current business is. It just kind of expands that opportunity for growth with more capital in their coffers. So I think we basically see a repeat. You know, you see this next run being the highest run, and then the run preceding that being a much smaller run because it won't be as gamma induced as this one was via options because he's holding more in the money. And expect GameStop to be the one to capitalize the most on the second run, while Roaring Kitty more than likely is bought deep in the money calls around this range. So I just want to say that's kind of, you know, we're expecting a repeat here, basically from 412 up until 613, starting on 613. So I just wanted to make that clear, and then I kind of want to quickly go over what I saw in the option chain today because I thought it was interesting, and at least show you what I'm looking at. So I'm looking at historically, and I just kind of want to go back and show you guys what I saw to make this as like obvious as possible. 424 through 426, he is purchasing a ton of calls. These are all at the ask, and these are very, very obvious. Look, he's purchasing 1,000 blocks, 5,000 blocks, tons of 1,000 blocks. This is like as clear as day, as obvious as possible that this is like one person making these trades. And you can see these ones right here are very obvious that aren't him. These are floor trades, okay? If you ever see these pop up, this is from the floor of a stock of an exchange. This is not this could not be DFV. Um, so I just want to point this out that he might be buying in smaller blocks this go around, but he seems very consistent in his pattern of purchasing in flat numbers. And the same goes for when he did, sorry, back in June here. Was it June? Or sorry, it was in May. When he's buying these in the money calls, he's buying 5,000 block increments, right? He buys all of his calls on the 621 mark in 5,000 block increments. Similar pattern as to when he sells. So moving forward here to whatever happened today, and I just kind of want to walk through with what I saw. I'm sorting it by 500 block increments. Um, I don't really see any specific pattern that would indicate that, you know, DFE is purchasing. And I want to be a little careful here because, again, the stock price is way higher. Options are still a little bit more expensive than what he purchased last time. So I'm just going to like kind of look at this from a safety standpoint and just see, because he was mainly purchasing large amounts of trades here with large amounts of money. I want to see at least what he's doing or if there's anything interesting at the $50,000 plus mark. And again, I'm expecting July July calls. I'm not expecting short dated calls here to be popping up. And what do you see? You see some things that might be interesting here. The 719 $60 call. There was a large block that was purchased here. Um, Not really lining up again with what he had purchased before of towards the end of the day, buying pattern wise. You see one on the July 5th, which is 2 weeks out, which this could be potentially interesting. You see a large block purchased here that exceeds the entire OI of the call purchased for 75 $24.50. This seems interesting to me potentially because it's at the money. He starts buying the at the money calls and out of the money calls at the start, but more in the kind of at the money calls. So you see a little bit more later in the day here. Again, nothing to really indicate any sort of obvious this is probably him. Um, you see some interesting activity here at the end of the day and midday on the 719 $30 calls. Again, nothing too obvious that would kind of indicate that it's him, maybe, but I kind of don't see anything that would lead to confirmation that was as obvious as last time. You don't really see any of these round numbers. of purchase calls. You see maybe a few 400s at the 719 mark at the $23 call. You see a 300. Let's just look at that one and see. That's at the end of the day. So that's interesting. I mean, it's pretty obvious at the end of the day here there was a really interesting large call purchase, I think, on these 719 $30 calls here. That was like a straight up spike, which is what you would have expected to see in the past here. I don't think this goes that far back. Yeah, it's unfortunate. But basically, at the end of the day, in the last few hours, you see massive amounts of calls being purchased. Most of those expiring 7.5 and 7.19. So again, maybe it's him. I don't really know for sure. There's definitely the possibility that it is him, but I don't think there's enough confirmation to show based off of his prior buying patterns that this end of day price action was him. So um, we'll see what happens over the next few days. I think probably tomorrow would be towards the end of the day or maybe throughout the day. The strongest indication is if we see any sort of unusual option activity that could lead to be him purchasing calls. So far, the strikes being purchased are in the few week out range, which is kind of what I was expecting, and at the money and out of the money. So you see a little bit of activity on that front. But again, maybe $500,000 to $1 million max. That could have potentially been him. If it was, it's just kind of the start of his buying. But we'll see what happens over the next few days here. Um, and I know I said this on the PB show. Like if I don't see this purchasing of calls, I think this whole theory kind of maybe doesn't hold as much water, at least on what DFV is doing in particular. It doesn't mean that these cycles are not going to occur. I think we probably need to wait more towards like 719 to ensure that. Maybe he was just kind of trying to show the game plan. I don't really know what his intentions were. If anything, he's just a savvy options trader, and could very well just unintentionally be timing these cycles quite well and playing off of what the market's showing him. And this is just all kind of the repercussions of kind of what he's doing, and it happens to time up really well with these cycles that might be occurring. So hard to say. It's all hypothetical. Be safe out there. Options are extremely risky. If you don't know what you're doing with options, do not mess around with them. Um, and yeah, that's all I have. But I just wanted to share a little bit more information here to kind of show you what I was seeing and a quick little update. I don't really plan to share updates anymore, but I think this should be, the full layout of what exactly I was expecting, not only with price action, but like what these full cycles look like. So, best of luck out there, and that's all I got. Take care.